So when we picture violence, usually it's something immediate, right? Something loud.
Yeah, exactly. Like
Yeah.
a bomb blast or
Yeah.
a war. Things you see on the news. Very visible.
Right, undeniable. It gets the headlines.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
That's the kind of spectacular violence that grabs our attention. It fits the mold.
Okay. But what about harm that isn't like that, that doesn't, explode onto the scene? What if it's something that just creeps up, unfolds really slowly, maybe over years, decades even?
Right.
Often totally unseen.
Well, that's exactly it. That's what we're really digging into today, this idea of slow violence.
Low violence.
Yeah, it's a really powerful concept. And, it often gets overlooked, but it completely changes how we think about what violence even is.
Yeah.
And crucially, who ends up bearing the brunt of it.
Right. So this deep dive, it's based on sources exploring this very idea, trying to get us to look past just the immediate shock. Our mission, then, is to unpack what slow violence really means. Why is it often so invisible? And how does it connect to these huge issues, like inequality and environmental damage?
Let's do it.
Okay, let's unpack this.
So the term itself, slow violence, it was really crystallized by the writer Rob Nixon.
Okay.
He wanted a way to talk about these kinds of harms that are just different from the big dramatic events that dominate the news.
So unlike that immediate spectacular stuff, slow violence is, well, it's gradual, delayed, spread out.
Precisely. It's dispersed across time and space. It lacks that spectacle. It doesn't make for a dramatic news clip.
And that delay, that sounds really key.
Oh, it's hugely significant. The damage, the injury, it isn't right there in front of you. The consequences might not show up for years. Think about illnesses emerging decades after someone was exposed to a toxin.
Or like ecosystems just slowly degrading over time.
Exactly. Things that collapse incrementally, not all at once.
Yes, it's not just when it happens, but where. You said dispersed?
Right. It's rarely just one spot. It can affect huge areas or, and this is critical in the sources, it often hits communities on the margins. Communities pushed out of sight, far from, the centers of power and media attention.
Okay, so the delay plus the distance. That's why it's often invisible.
That's a huge part of it, yeah. Because it doesn't fit the breaking news model. It just slips through the cracks. Media doesn't cover it much. Policymakers might ignore it. The public often doesn't even know it's happening.
And here's the really tough part, isn't it? The sources point out who actually suffers most.
Yes. Consistently, it's those with the least power to fight back. Poor communities, racialized groups, indigenous populations.
Yeah.
People who don't have the political leverage or, frankly, the media platform to make their suffering seen and heard.
It really forces you to question what we even count as violence, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It disrupts that whole notion that harm only matters if it's immediate, if it's visible.
So are we saying something isn't really violence if we can't see it happen right now? Is that the implication?
Well, that's the question Nixon pushes us towards. Why do we tend to ignore suffering that's stretched out over time or hidden away in, complex systems and policies?
Yeah.
He argues that we need a pretty fundamental shift in how we think about this. Move away from just reacting to the shock and awe moments and develop more of a reflective, long-view ethics. We need to actually learn to see the harm that builds up slowly, that's driven by policy, that's embedded in our institutions.
And speaking of institutions, that's key too, right? It's often structural.
Absolutely fundamental.
Yeah.
Slow violence isn't always about one bad guy. Often it's the systems themselves, the structures we live in, that are carrying it out.
The sources gave examples, like governments, through neglecting infrastructure maybe, or harmful policies.
Yes, the Flint water crisis is such a stark example from the materials. Governmental decisions, neglect. It led to the slow, long-term poisoning of an entire community. That's systemic.
And corporations too, presumably.
Definitely. Think about extractive industries. The gradual degradation of ecosystems, the health impacts on communities living near mines or factories. That harm accumulates over years, often as a side effect of the economic model itself.
Even the media you mentioned, by omission.
Yeah, or cultural industries.
Yeah.
By simply not telling the stories of those affected, especially if they're poor or in the global south.
Yeah.
If it's not reported, if it's not part of the narrative, it's effectively invisible to many people.
And that makes accountability incredibly difficult, I mean.
Hugely difficult.
Yeah.
Because it's so diffuse. It happens over decades, maybe across borders. There's often no single person, no single moment to point to. How do you assign blame for something so slow and complex?
Okay, and there was this really interesting framework in Nixon's work you mentioned about time.
Ah, yes. This is fascinating.
Yeah.
He contrasts two different timescales.
Which are?
Ecological time versus political time.
Okay, ecological time.
That's the long-term rhythm of the environment. Decades, centuries, millennia. Think about climate change, desertification, the slow buildup of plastics in the ocean. That's ecological time.
Got it. And political time.
Much, much faster.
Yeah.
It runs on election cycles, news cycles, immediate crises that demand quick responses, public outrage that flares up and dies down.
Ah, I see the clash already.
Exactly. And the consequence, slow violence, those long-term environmental shifts, or rising cancer clusters near industrial zones, or ocean acidification, it gets ignored because its timescale just doesn't match the urgency of politics.
So it only becomes a crisis when
the damage is often already done.
Yeah.
Deeply entrenched, maybe even irreversible. The political system reacts too late because the problem developed too slowly for its radar.
Wow. And this connects directly back to inequality, doesn't it? You mentioned race, class.
Deeply. Slow violence doesn't happen in a vacuum. It intersects profoundly with race, class, and the legacies of colonialism.
Who gets hit hardest?
Well, the sources point to groups with less power, less visibility. Indigenous communities, for instance, often dealing with the long-term toxic legacy of things like uranium mining on their lands. The health effects might not show up for generations.
And poorer nations.
Often exploited for resources in ways that cause gradual harm, or used as dumping grounds for waste from wealthier countries. Again, slow accumulating damage.
And even within rich countries.
You see it in cities. Often it's low-income communities, frequently communities of color, who end up living in the most polluted areas because of economic pressures or discriminatory housing practices. They lack the political voice to stop it.
And Nixon argues this isn't always just an accident, this invisibility.
No, he makes a powerful case that it can be almost designed, a feature, not a bug. A modern kind of imperialism, perhaps, or just systemic neglect that serves certain interests.
Okay, so understanding slow violence helps us see these connections. How does it relate to other concepts, like structural violence?
Great question. They're definitely related. Think of structural violence, Johan Galtung's idea. That's about how social structures themselves cause harm. Not direct violence, but the system itself. Laws, economic policies, healthcare access, preventing people from meeting basic needs. It creates harm through inequality.
Like poverty leading to malnutrition or disparities in health outcomes based on race.
Exactly. It's harm built into the system.
And then there's environmental racism.
Right. That's specifically about how environmental hazards, pollution, toxic waste sites disproportionately impact communities of color.
So things like locating factories in predominantly black neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Or Flint, again.
Precisely. It's racialized harm tied to environmental injustice, rooted in systemic discrimination.
So how do these three ideas, slow, structural, environmental racism, fit together?
They often overlap and reinforce each other. Slow violence can be a form of structural violence. When the system, through policy or neglect, causes gradual harm to certain groups, that's both structural and slow. Makes sense. And environmental racism is often a type of slow violence. Take Cancer Alley in Louisiana, which the sources mention. Decades of exposure to industrial chemicals leading to high cancer rates in predominantly black communities. That's slow, toxic harm inflicted along racial lines.
So the slow violence is the mechanism of the environmental racism in that case.
You could see it that way.
Yeah.
And the underlying structural violence, things like discriminatory housing, lack of political power, creates the conditions for that environmental racism, for that slow violence to happen and persist.
Okay, let me try to sum that up. Slow violence is about when the harm happens gradually over time.
Yep.
Structural violence is about how it happens through the systems and institutions.
Right, the embedded way.
And environmental racism highlights who disproportionately suffers from certain kinds of this slow systemic environmental harm, specifically marginalized racial groups.
That's a great way to put it. They're different lenses, but they're often focused on interconnected aspects of the same reality.
Okay, so bringing this back to you, the listener, why does getting this understanding slow violence actually matter? What are the implications?
Well, for activism, for one thing, it means we need what some call anticipatory justice, not just reacting after disaster strikes, but demanding changes before the slow damage becomes irreversible, requires looking ahead.
And for telling the story. Since it's not dramatic,
Storytelling becomes absolutely crucial. Because slow violence lacks that immediate punch, you need other ways to make it visible. Art, books, documentaries. They can trace these quiet devastations, give voice to the silenced. They make the invisible felt.
and for policy, ethics,
It means things like climate policy, public health, city planning. They have to think about cumulative harm. They need to factor in these long-term disperse effects. It's not just about fixing immediate problems. It's about preventing that slow-motion collapse.
Right. So to kind of wrap this up, slow violence isn't that there's no violence, it's a very specific kind.
Exactly. It's the violence of neglect, of denial, of kicking the can down the road until it's too late.
It's a sobering thought, really. That silence, that slowness, it can be deadly. And just because we ignore something doesn't mean it isn't hurting someone, somewhere, right now.
That's the hard truth of it.
You know, in a world facing such huge ecological challenges, such deep systemic inequalities, maybe slow violence is the defining form of harm for our time.
It's certainly a powerful contender.
So what does this all mean for you? Maybe just seeing it, recognizing this quiet violence for what it is. Maybe that's the first, most vital step towards actually resisting it, towards repair.